Son of Charlemagne by Barbara Willard. Chapter 11. Emperor. It was Duke Eric, the king's old and reliable friend and adviser, who made the first true conquest of the Avars. He it was who broke the famed fortifications of the Ring, with its terrible palisades of thorn, and rode back to Charles the Great, bearing loads of fabulous treasure. With him on this triumphal homeward journey rode the Teuton, an Avarian ruler who came to make submission to the king and to ask for Christian baptism. Only a year had passed since the death of Fastrada, but that year had seen great changes. Now, indeed, it did seem as though everything that had been spoken of her was true. If the king had been under an enchantment, he rose from it like a lion uncaged, to rage and roar about his world with all the vigor of his younger days, and with twice the power. For now he knew how he must control his anger, how to win men by trusting them, how to conserve his forces, how to guard against treachery. Duke Eric rode back through the deep winter to the palace at Aachen, with great trains of pack horses carrying treasure. The family had assembled for the Christmas festival, and they were still together. The welcome given to the Duke and his men could hardly have been louder, or warmer, or more admiring. "I should have been there," the king cried. "Why was I not there with you, Eric?" "It would have been a greater triumph for us all," Duke Eric said generously. "But tell us we have done well in your behalf, for it was hard going." "Truly you have done well," the king cried. Then in the great hall, with the fire of huge branches leaping and blazing, in the glare of torches which filled the air with light and smoke, and the smell of resin, the treasures were tumbled out before the king. Great rubies, golden vessels studded with sapphires, emerald ornaments, chains of beaten silver, and bracelets encrusted with amethyst and turquoise, platters of copper, traced and beaten, strings of ivory, great masses of amber and jade, fantastic weapons with carved and jeweled hilts, shields of silver, drinking vessels of polished horn, furs and silks, and embroideries made with threads of gold and silver. The stored plunder from 100 kingdoms, now plundered in its turn, was poured into the lap of King Charles of the Franks, as he sat with his family and his court gathered about him. With each new marvel, as it came to light, the cries of wonder grew, while those who had brought home these riches looked on in satisfaction and delight in their own prowess, that the king could not praise too highly. Then the king began to laugh with pure pleasure himself, and he pulled gems like plums from the ever-increasing mound that winked and gleamed in the torchlight and the light of the fire. "Here, Rotrid, take this ring. Bertha, the pearl is yours. Carl, yours the chains, the golden chains with the ruby clasp. Louis shall have the chalice with emeralds. Pepin, here, take these for your wife when you choose her. Where are the children? Theodrata, Himmeltrude, come to me here. Choose what you will of these enormous toys. And Lietgarda, come, give me your hand, the greatest prize for you." Lietgarda moved forward laughing. She was fair and comfortable and modest. She was, in fact, the new stepmother whom every one of the family, save perhaps Louis, already loved. The king had to have a woman by his side. He was lost without whatever austere Louis of Aquitaine might say in disapproval. This time his choice could not have been a happier one. Now, as she stooped her head and he placed a little crown of gold and rubies on her shining hair, A murmur of pleasure and approval went round the gathering. Rotrid, close behind her, leaned forward and kissed Liutgarda's cheek. Smiling, Bertha touched her hand. Pepin put his arm around her waist and gave her a quick, warm embrace. It made Carl laugh aloud to see his father, surrounded by his family, tossing the treasure about, enjoying himself so hugely. Now they were all friends again, as closely knit as any laborer's family crowded into a cottage. With the family gifts dispensed, the king made fair divisions among the men who had carried it home. None was forgotten, least of all the widows of those who had not returned. Now the king was choosing for Alcuin, no longer at court. He had gone to be abbot of the great monastery of St. Martin of Tours, and there he said he would stay to await the final knocking on the gate. The king set aside piece after piece of splendid plate. This I shall send to Pope Hadrian, and it shall be an earnest for the soul of the Teuton, who now seeks baptism. He looked round him rather as he looked round the table when he had not decided who should read aloud to them while they dined. I need a trusted ambassador. It shall be Anghilbert. They must spare you from St. Riquier, Anghilbert, while you make the journey to Rome. Anghilbert bowed and smiled faintly. He glanced at Bertha. Even in this mellow mood of his, the king still plotted to separate these two who had dared to become husband and wife against his wishes. When he had decided that Anghilbert should be his ambassador to Pope Hadrian, the king began tumbling the treasure back into the chests and bales it had been carried in. At the last, he suddenly seized hold of a silver dish. I have given nothing to my dwarfling. Here, Einhard, take this and remember me. The king embraced his one-time secretary, now near to being his chancellor, and everyone crowded round to look at the silver dish Einhard held tenderly in both hands. Our father is a great man, Carl said to Louis, who was standing by his side. God keep him so. He is a happy man, too. He looked at his brother and saw the austere, thin face wearing an expression of pale disapproval. What now, Louis? There's too much luxury and love of splendor. I would sweep the place clean of it, if I were king of this palace. Sweep your own palace clean, snapped Carl, and heaven send that you marry a woman who will turn you into a human, not only a man. Louis did not reply, but he gave a slight, contemptuous smile. He looked across to where Count Ingris's daughter, Ermengarde, sat with a dozen or more ladies. Then he smiled again, a shade more warmly, and Ermengarde smiled back. Poor foolish girl, Carl said to Bertha later that evening. She sits waiting for his glance to fall on her. I would need a finer prize than to be Queen of Aquitaine before I would marry my brother Louis. She is a silly sheep and deserves all she may get, replied Bertha shortly. Rotrid tells me she is a pious girl. She prays a great deal, Bertha admitted, but I always think her prayers must be directed all to one end, that she may be a king's wife. With the enormous sensation of our treasure and the plans for its distribution, the Christmas season came to an end. The brothers began making arrangements to return to their kingdoms. For Carl, too, there were plans that would take him from home, and although he had his kingdom now and must set about its management, this would always be home to him. Pepin and Louis, however welcome, must always be visitors, and this seemed both sad and strange to Carl. His father remained a hero to him, no less loved, no less admired, because he knew that heroes human faults and failings. He knew, too, the strange, unpredictable humility with which the hero so often strove to remedy those faults. That a man could be a giant before men and a suppliant before God seemed to Carl as it might well do, to be the very pinnacle of human behavior. Angilbert's embassy to Pope Hadrian was on the point of setting out for Rome when news came by courier that kept him at home after all. "On Christmas Day, my Lord King," said the courier, standing before Charles, "His Holiness departed this life and entered into the kingdom of God." The king cried out in bitter sorrow. Pope Hadrian had been to him not only the sovereign pontiff, the vicar of Christ, the bishop of Rome, but also a man who knew how to be a friend. Charles turned aside and wept for this friend, and those who were with him at the time stayed silent. They respected his grief, were moved by its sincerity to a depth of sympathy they were unable to express. Now Pope Leo III sat on the throne of St. Peter. This might greatly affect the future, as Charles knew well enough. He set aside his sorrow for the dead Hadrian to consider where he stood. Though he had never, in all these years, spoken to anyone but Karl of his highest ambition, it had become an open secret. There were hints from time to time, encouragements. Karl thought often of the day when his father would stand at the head of a new Roman Empire. So splendid a climax would be suited to a career which, in spite of many setbacks, had already been fabulous. Only one thing had stood between the king's hope and its possibility of fulfillment. Now, quite suddenly, there might be two obstacles to overcome. The first, and most obvious, was the fact that the young Emperor Constantine had now come of age and sat on the imperial throne. The second was that Pope Hadrian's death left the king no absolute certainty of support from Rome. He did not know Pope Leo. Would he be a supporter or an opposer of the plan should it ever come to the point of open discussion? At the feast of St. Michael, Alcuin sent a set of verses from Tours to his friend and monarch. "Michael, archangel of the King of Kings, give ear to our voices. We acknowledge thee to be the prince of the citizens of heaven, and at thy prayer God sends his angels unto man." The verses ran on, steady and splendid, prayer and poem in one. And at the foot of the manuscript, Alcuin had written in his own hand, "Emperor, thy scholar made these melodies for thee." The manuscript was handed about among those who were able to read it. The word emperor was suddenly heard on the lips of those about the court, whispered, but whispered firmly. A new feeling of excitement, of striving toward a future glorious and powerful, in which they might take their humble part, inspired those about the king at that time. There was a mounting tension, though how this thing might be accomplished, none could know, and none dared ask. The right of the Emperor Constantine to the imperial throne was well established. The right of Charles the Great was the right of achievement, worth, faith, and power. It remained to be seen which would prevail. There were envoys waiting at Aachen when the king rode back to winter quarters after a summer campaign that had proved outstandingly successful. "They are sent from the Empress Irene," Einhard told the king. Charles was tired but content at this homecoming. The long years of planning and reestablishing among the tribes and races in Europe were beginning to bear fruit. The conquered people now fought on the Frankish side. The king's forces had become enormous. If he had been able to find fodder for a large enough body of horse, he would have continued his campaign that year after the weather broke. But this was not practicable. So he returned to Aachen to one of those family winters he enjoyed so well. He was 56 that year, the last but one of the old century. A moment of pause and portent and nameless promise. The king looked critically at Einhard. How pale you are! You are not sickening, Dwarfling. Einhard shook his head. Not bodily, my lord. There is a sickness in my thoughts, for I have spoken with the envoys. Karl found his father and Einhard together. Let them speak for themselves, Einhard was saying. Do not ask me to report their tidings for them. Why, what has happened to you, Einhard? Karl asked, laughing. You are not usually so chary about speaking out. Indeed, they always teased Einhard for his ready tongue and wondered how he had ever been so shy a lad that it had been difficult to get 2 words together out of him. Send for the envoys, the king said, cutting short Karl's laughter. There is no need for delay. Bring them immediately. Within the hour, he had heard the tidings that the envoys brought from the imperial court in Byzantium. The story was like some terrible echo of the degenerate days of Rome, or of the Dark Ages, when the Merovingian kings had slaughtered and ravaged their way through Europe, to be put down at last by King Charles's own grandfather, Charles the Hammer. In the days of regency had given the Empress Irene a love of power, which she could not bear to relinquish. The young Emperor Constantine, the envoys hastened to explain, had seemed ill-fitted for government. They did not add what the world already knew, that his mother had kept him in submission and neglected his education until he was, in fact, little better than a witless boy when he came to the throne. What the envoys had to tell was this: that the Empress had deposed her son and now reigned in his place. But this bald fact was not what had sickened Einhard. The further truth emerged gradually, the envoys endeavoring to put a gloss upon the matter to excuse the Empress, who had so treated her own son. It had been entirely for his own good, the envoys implied, that the Empress Irene had had her son blinded and sent as a prisoner to a convenient monastery. Then the envoys hastened to say that the Empress herself had not intended the mutilation. Her orders were misunderstood. Some enemy of the young emperor had in fact been responsible. To this monster, the king said when the envoys had been coldly dismissed, I might have delivered my Rotrid. I am thinking of other things, said Karl. Rotrid's broken betrothal to Constantine was ancient history, and no longer worth speaking about. But there was indeed something more, something immensely important that emerged from this story with such force it seemed to strike Karl a great blow upon the brow. He looked at his father and steeled himself to be bold as he had never been before. It was time for him to speak again the word that Alcuin had used. I am thinking, he said, that the Empress cannot legally sit on the imperial throne. I am thinking that it is she who should be deposed and another crowned in her place. An emperor, my lord, the Emperor Charles. In the silence that followed, he wondered if he had been too bold. The king did not look at him, but sat brooding, and over the rest who were there, a hush, so expectant that it seemed entirely breathless, hung like some spell. When at last the king stirred, it was with a sharp, dismissive movement. His hand touched Karl's, then pushed him gently away. He gave a slight, soft laugh. This lad is after my place already, he said lightly. If you make me emperor, Karl, beware of what you do to yourself, for you will be king of the Franks then. Karl laughed in his turn. The moment which had seemed taut with expectation and even danger slid safely by. But Karl would remember it, the moment when it had seemed certain at last that the dream would become a reality.